Iain Watson. Now, somewhere between this country's manicured cityscapes and lush countryside lie ugly, overlooked places that most of us quite happily ignore. But the writer Nick Papadimitriou has been documenting these unglamorous spaces for decades, picking up celebrity fans and comparisons with William Blake and Coleridge. The BBC's arts editor, Will Gompertz, decided to find out what all the fuss is about along that great national treasure, the M25.
A vast, yet largely invisible presence hovers over the northern suburbs of London. Screened from the consciousness of the city dweller by the pressures of the day-to-day and a rabidly anthropocentric culture, Scarp broods and awaits its benediction.
He's a writer to the defiantly non-manicured tips of his fingers.
He seems very mundane and ordinary in lots of ways, but he sort of obviously sees magic in everything.
He is the figure of the Edgelands. He is like he is like a Blakean voyager.
They're talking about Nick Papadimitriou, a 52-year-old writer who uses scrapbooks to document his North London landscape in minute detail.
What I write about now is far more fragmentary, but also has a lot of focus on hyper-particularities, tiny bits of rust on gateposts, discarded objects in the landscape.
He's not usual, nor are his fans.
Plus, I suppose there's nothing, sort of if you read, I don't know, like sort of Wordsworth or the paintings of Turner, we can all see there's magic in sort of the ocean or in the sort of the Great British countryside, but it takes an interesting mind to look at sort of say, oh, I saw this power station in Middlesex and thinks it's Kubla Khan.
I do try and bring something back from every walk that I go on. I feel that the objects are almost alive and I don't want them to just slip into oblivion. I'm creating a storage vat in my flat in which the region is contained in miniature form. And at some point I want to upload all of that into my brain so that I walk around carrying my region inside my mind.
This rather idiosyncratic view of the world has been an inspiration to Will's self, who asked him to help with research on his novel, The Book of Dave.
He has remained as a kind of fixed point around which I've revolved, and certainly, I've somewhat abandoned the whole peripatetic writing now, but during this last 10 years, if I think of an ideal interlocutor, because I always walk and travel alone, it's either my father, who was an academic who specialised in urban and regional development, so he had that kind of view of this thing, or it's Nick.
And this would be London Borough of Enfield. This is Southgate.
He spends hours at home poring over charts.
This map shows a section of the South Hertfordshire escarpment.
Seeking out the lost and forgotten stories hidden in the hinterland of outer suburbia. He has now emerged from the wastelands he documents as a writer of note. He has a lucrative contract from a major publisher for the book he is currently writing, called Scarp.
On summer evenings, when the sun sets furthest north, Scarp casts its shadow over the serried ranks of housing which shatter against its southern rim.
His subject is a belt of land just north of London. His method is something he describes as deep topography.
What is deep topography?
Well, topography is the study of the land and its details. And I applied the adjective to deep to the word in order to describe the kind of magnitude of experience I was having when I went walking.
We're just walking over the M1 now. Why have you chosen this piece of land to concentrate your efforts?
It's an invisible landscape, the North Middlesex or South Hertfordshire escarpment, 14 miles long, runs across the north of London, is curiously invisible.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's visible to the eye once you know it's there, but it seems to have no kind of cultural presence, unlike, say, the Chiltern Scarp or the North and South Downs. There's a curious lateral shift in walking out from, say, cosmopolitan Edgware up onto the Edgware-Berry uplands where we are right now, the sense of stepping outside of time, or maybe even stepping into time.
For all his eccentricity, and there is plenty of it, Nick Papadimitriou's practice of chronicling bypasses and the passed by has been present in literature for centuries.
It's a very British tradition, which takes in people like Wainwright going across the Lake District, goes back to Coleridge. It's about people engaging in a really heavy-duty way with a single piece of landscape and digging into it. It's a kind of archaeological movement and therefore very, very attractive. And it doesn't come with French philosophical baggage.
He's referring to Guy Debord and the French situationists of the 1950s and 60s, who had their apogee with the Parisian wildcat strikes in 1968. Their concept was psychogeography, a study of the effect the urban environment has on behaviour. Meanwhile, back in the UK, J.G. Ballard was tackling the same subject in a different way. Images of dystopian modernity framed in bleak man-made landscapes was more his thing. And then there was this.
It really isn't the kind of place you'd expect to go for a stroll to escape that traffic jam. It's derelict, noisy, smelly in the summer months, and to some tastes, I imagine, downright ugly. But stop and look just a little closer.
Richard Mabey's book, The Unofficial Countryside, published in 1973, became a classic of its type. A nature writer finding beauty in the gravel beds and derelict landscape of outer London's edgelands. He might be happy identifying wildlife, but he's not so keen on some literary classifications.
This phrase, deep topography or psychogeography, what do you make of them?
Well, I find them, to some extent, babble. I think that phrases like that are very confusing, and I'm not sure, when you start to scrutinise what they mean, that anything sensible comes out. The engagement between human emotions and landscape, let's say, has been one of the backbones of not just non-fiction writing, but fiction writing in languages across the world. And I don't think a particular perspective on that needs to invent a new jargon phrase.
Whatever you call it, the act of focusing on the everyday, the mundane, the stuff most of us don't see because we're too busy rushing to the next thing, is of importance.
Look there, look at this footprint. Look at this worm crawling out of that footprint. Look at that maggot. Smell the rubbish. You need these people who are actually producing deep evidence of the local to contradict the grand and universal images that have been given to us. Because there's this sort of globalization of imagery, and there's the people who want to swim in cyberspace, and the opposite, these magical people who emerged from some mystery out of the fog, bearing information in rucksacks and carrying stuff home. Those are the people I want to trust, and Nick is one of them.